In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Shah's Rose. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. A very nice and approachable pink with a slight magenta lean to it. It maintains pink without looking like a washed out red. It does give some tone variation by nib, and all the tones are pleasant. And most of the time, it'll be very do over. A very nice and approachable pink with a slight magenta lean to it. It maintains a pink without looking like a washed out red. It does give tone variation by nib, and all of the tones are pleasant, and most of the time, pretty readable. It always shades and does it nicely and consistently. Of course, non-fountain pen paper may not shade as well. Pink is difficult to do well and even harder to fit personal preferences to. I think this one is done very well. It's just not fitting my personal preference for a pink. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Noodler's Nib Creeper. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the posting nib, it is pretty light, but it is readable. I wouldn't prefer to be using an ink this light, but I think you could use it for editing without any kinds of problem. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. You definitely see some shading going on and some much darker lines, especially when it's an up and down stroke like on the T of introduced on the third line. Of course, that whole word starts darker, it gets lighter, it gets dark at the D, and then lightens up again. The Aerofine nib gives about the same tone that we were seeing with the posting, but the thicker line really is showing that pink much better. Now, the scribbliness on the first word, that was me, not the pen or the ink. The writing here has no feathering, it has no spread, it does shade very well. I think the shading shows up better than it did with the posting nib. I think the wetter pen really helped that. Looking at the Architect nib, we have I'm going to call it around the same tone because there's a lot of fluctuation we're going to see here. We get no feather, we get no spread. The shading that's going on is truly outstanding. This is not a nib that I write with well, but I think what's happening here in the writing is pretty good. The beginning of the first word, orbits, that was my fault because the pen sat for a little too long and it had a little bit of hard starting that was a little over a week of sitting. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience, all of the writing samples are done with a TWSBI Vac Mini with a posting nib, a TWSBI Eco with an Aero nib that is fine, a TWSBI Mini with an Architect, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtturm 1917 paper. Looking at the posting nib, it is just a little bit darker in tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. I think much, much easier to read, much nicer to look at. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading, though the darker tone and more absorbent nature of the paper is making the shading is not as obvious. But look at Newton's on the second line, where the N starts as a midtone, gets dark at the second part of the N, and then lighter into the rest of the word. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than we had with the posting nib. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It does shade fairly well. It is very easy to read on this page. We can see a little bit of that magenta lean that this ink has here. It's starting to show up. It didn't happen so much on the Clairfontaine, but on some of the non-fountain pen papers, we are going to see a little bit of that tone. Looking at the Architect nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the Aero Fine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading extremely well. And I really like the way this is shading right here. I think this looks very nice. We're definitely seeing some of that magenta lean, and it's kind of funny because we can see the pink into a kind of magenta leaning pink, like on the word can in the first line or easily in the first line. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the posting nib, we get very much the tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We're not getting any feathering or spreading. We're not getting any shading at all in this case. Now, I see one word that looks a little bit darker. It's the on the third line. It looks a little darker than what's around it, but that's pretty much it for the shading. It's a readable tone. It's pleasant on there. It's just not shading. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the posting nib, much darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering or spreading. It is shading very well. And in this case, we're shading from a light pink to a dark pink. We are not seeing that magenta lean. I think the slight tone change of this paper is really helping to keep it a pink and not let it lean towards that magenta. Looking at the Architect nib, we get just a little bit darker than we had with the Aero Fine. We do get tiny little bits of shading. You see it on the TY of relativity. It's not bad. You see it a tiny bit on the word intended. Again, not bad. There's no real spread going on. There is very good shading going on, exceptional shading, especially with this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. It stays well behaved because we can easily write back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, it is a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, though we can still read it. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's giving tiny bits maybe of shading, just maybe, not very much. I wouldn't expect this really on here for the shading, but we do see little darker areas like the second L of well and the S of as. Looking at the Aerofine nib, it is much darker than it was with the posting nib, and it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It isn't feathering, it is not spreading, it is kind of shading. Kind of. I mean, applications, you definitely see it. But on of the truly starts dark and works its way to a mid-tone lighter. It's shading, just not tons. Looking at the Architect nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the Aerofine nib. It is just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it is feathering a tiny little bit. You see it at the V to E, which is very messy. First word on the first line. Now, when you see Imperial, that sloppiness was me, not the ink. There's no real spread going on. There is some shading. Look at the third line, has been vindicated. A lot of shading going on in that line. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we have no bleeding and no ghosting. The biggest ghosting issue is the Architect nib, which is not bad. You could still write on the back of this page. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Cerise. Here is Geherban Rose Cyclamen. Here is Noodler's Bay State Cape Cod Cranberry. Here is Sailor Pêche. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is also leaning a little bit more towards that kind of magenta-y tone. Still kind of pink, kind of magenta, a little confusing to look at. It doesn't feather. It does spread just a tiny bit, and that's only because I'm looking at them side by side. It is shading, which frequently I see as a warning sign for bad news with this paper. Looking at the Aerofine, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the posting. It is a bit darker than it was, quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is not feathering, not spreading, both absolutely shocking. It is shading. This looks very nice on here, considering this paper generally doesn't do well with inks, and I hope it holds up. Looking at the Architect nib, the tone is just a little bit darker than it was with the Aerofine, which is quite a bit darker than it was with the posting nib. Here on this paper, it is just about the same tone that it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a tiny bit. I mean, on the third line, actually, you see a little. On the fourth line, chose. On the fifth line, Lobachevsky, you see it a little bit, but it's not bad. There's almost no spread and no shading. Looking at the back of the page, I don't think you could write on the back of this page because the amount of ghosting, perhaps with the posting, or a lot of ghosting, perhaps with the posting nib, but none of this bled through and touched the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a purple ink by Diatramentis, their Purple Violet. Here is a gray ink by Diamine, their 150th anniversary Silver Fox. Here is a brown ink by Roher and Klinger, Document Brown. Here is a black ink by Private Reserve, Ultra Black Fast Dry. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, it is a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, both very manageable considering the paper, not too bad. It does not shade. It's pretty much there, but it is a pink and not a magenta. Looking at the Aerofine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the posting nib, a lot darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. You're going to see that I had a little bit of a drying out issue, and I don't know what caused it. But after I re-primed it, we start to get very much a magenta tone. I haven't had a problem with this pen, and it didn't look like the paper was sucking the ink out of it. I don't know what happened there. Looking at the Architect nib, it is lighter than it was with the Aerofine. It is about the same tone as the posting nib. Quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather. It does spread. It does not shade. It is pink again. So, yay, pink. Looking at the page underneath, you can see plenty of spaces where I did circle that it did touch the page underneath. Seeing the back of the page, the ghosting really wasn't that bad, especially with the posting nib, but I don't think you could write back here. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This goes well in any pen except for dry fines, where it's just too darn light. But for me, I like this from a medium flow stub. It gives good color, and it has very nice shading. It's pleasant on the page. It doesn't turn into that pink into magenta, but stays pink, because I don't want pink to be magenta. I want pink to be pink. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.